Lindsay and Jordan, I'm so glad to see you both tonight. Glad you could make it. Lindsay and Jordan tonight.
Thanks for joining our class. That was awesome.
Yes, I'm glad. And I forgot to mention, I'll send you all a copy of the PowerPoint slides as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. Dr. Bryant, they are students at Lenore-Rhine in South Carolina, and I spoke to their class about allyship and action and bridging the gap between faith and mental health.
Oh, fantastic. So the conversation continues. That's it.
Absolutely.
Great.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Talking with Dr. T. We will get started in just a moment. So glad you all could join us tonight. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Talking with Dr. T this November. I hope everyone is doing well. I see people joining us on Zoom, and I also see people joining us on Facebook Live. Please continue to share the link for other people for a great conversation that we will have tonight. So it is 8:01 and I will get started. I just want to say thank you for all that saw my message about my guest from last month, and we're going to try to get him on in January or February. He had a loss in his family, so thank you all who saw the message and keeping Donovan Darius in prayer. And I look forward to having him and talking about bridging the gap between faith, mental health, family, and professional athletics, college athletics. I will have a special guest for November, so please be on the lookout for the advertisement, and I'm excited to have him. And so I will announce his name in the next couple days. And then for tonight, for November, I am very excited and just honored and humbled to have Dr. Thema Bryant. And so I'm just going to read her brief bio, but then we're going to talk a little bit more about her background. Dr. Thema Bryant completed her doctorate in clinical psychology at Duke University and her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical Center's Victim of Violence program. Upon graduating, she became the coordinator of the Princeton University SHARE Program, which provides intervention and prevention programming to combat sexual assault, sexual harassment, and harassment based on sexual orientation. She is currently a tenured professor of psychology in the Graduate School of Education and Psychology at Pepperdine University, where she directs the Culture and Trauma Research Laboratory. Her clinical and research interests center on interpersonal trauma and the societal trauma of oppression. She is the past president of the Society for the Psychology of Women and past APA representative to the United Nations. She also served on the APA Committee on International Relations and Psychology and the Committee of Women's Psychology. She is currently the president-elect of the American Psychological Association. Additionally, having earned a Master's of Divinity, Dr. Thema is an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She directs the mental health ministry at First AME Church in South Los Angeles. And she also utilizes sacred dance and spoken word in therapy, community forums, and faith communities. Welcome, Dr. Bryant, to Talking with Dr. T tonight.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be with you, and I have to just share, and it messes up everybody, so no worries. But my first name is pronounced Thema. So the
Thema,
H is
oh, I
silent.
apologize. I am
Yes, no
so
worries.
sorry. I am so sorry. I
It's
apologize.
my whole life, so
Yes,
it's
I
okay. I'm used to it.
apologize.
No worries.
So thank you for being here tonight. And I read a little bit of your bio. And I know in your most recent book, Homecoming, you shared a little bit more about who you are and your background. But for those who may not have read the book or know anything about your background, can you provide us a little bit more about your professional and your ministerial journey?
Certainly. So I am the daughter of two ministers. And so growing up in the church, what I was more used to or exposed to was pastoral counseling. And so whenever people were in crisis in our community or in our church, they would call to speak with my parents or make appointments at the church. And so in the book, I share that my first time working a crisis hotline was growing up in a parsonage and just being aware of who people feel safe with in terms of telling their truths and their challenges and sharing their wounds. And so from an early age, I really was a listener and someone who I would say was formed in part to bear witness and a desire to help people to heal. And so when I discovered that psychology was a field in and of itself, I really feel that that was a sacred calling and that it is sacred work. And so I pursued my degree in psychology first. And it's only since once I became a psychologist, that I accepted the call into ministry. And I had a lot of hesitation around that because growing up, the model that I saw for ministry was people who do that full time. And because I knew that my life's work was really going to be around psychology, I had that false choice of thinking it was either or. And so as I got older and outside of my community, I met more people who were bivocational. And so once I really understood that you can be fully and wholly both things, I embraced that. And that has been a wonderful opportunity for me, like you, to be a bridge between the mental health communities and the faith communities so that people also don't feel they have to choose between their spiritual lives and getting support for mental health.
Absolutely. Thank you. There are a couple questions I think for our listening audience, just so we have a point of reference. How would you define spirituality versus religion?
Yes. So spirituality is the individual journey that connects you to that which is higher than you. And some experience that and name that as God, but there are people who are spiritual who do not name that as God. Religion has a doctrine involved, so there is set teaching, there are set rules or commandments. It is organized in that way. And some people make a false choice to say, are you spiritual or religious? But I would say that anyone who is authentically religious would need to also have that spiritual component, meaning that it is not just about church membership, but it is about our interior walk. It is a relationship, right, with God. And so a person can be religious and spiritual. A person can be spiritual but not religious. And I want to say there are people who are very religious and not spiritual, that nothing on the inside has shifted, but they follow all the rules, except maybe the rule of humility. So, in terms of our spiritual practice, that can include going out in nature. That can include, for me, the expressive arts, that many people who are artistic or creative may feel the most connected to the divine, to the sacred, when they are writing or painting or dancing, that it has a way of getting at the core of who we are. And so for religion, I want to say, as it relates to the study of psychology, that there's positive religious coping and negative religious coping. And so for some people, if your idea of your higher power, your source, God, is an entity that loves you, that cares about you, that wants good for you, then we would talk about that as positive religious coping. If at my core, I believe that God is angry and out to catch me messing up because God ultimately wants to punish me, then that's negative religious coping. And it does not require a $1 million grant, although they have conducted them, to know positive religious coping is associated with more healthy mental health outcomes than negative religious coping. So one example is a study that was done in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and they interviewed the children, and children who had positive religious coping would say things like, Hurricane Katrina was so terrible, but God helped us, protected our lives, and we made it. And then children with negative religious coping would say, God sent Hurricane Katrina to New Orleans because we sinned too much, right? So you can just take that and apply that to any messaging that people receive. And unfortunately, sometimes when people have gone to ministers or other religious people who feel like they have to have an answer for everything and don't have an answer, they will make up reasons that really paint the picture of an angry God, right? So literally, people have been told that they were molested because God wanted to test their faith, right? So you want to just picture, like, what kind of God is that? So in counseling and in life, it's not just important to ask, like, do people believe in God, but tell me about the God you believe in, because your idea of who that is gonna really can really alter your life.
Yes, absolutely. Boy, and this goes back to what I said I wanted to bring up, why it's important for ministries to be trauma informed. But that is a prime example, because here it is, somebody may be preaching from the pulpit, this caring God, this loving God, but somebody who's coming from this negative religious coping, sitting in the pews, might be having this disconnect.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. For some people, it is hard to believe and receive and accept God's love. That when you have been raised with that, both in doctrine and maybe also your example, people like to refer to God as Father. Some
Yes.
people refer to God as Mother, Father, Creator, God. But if your model of that is someone whose love was very conditional,
Yes.
it can be hard to believe, like, could God really love me?
Yes.
Right? So that is a part of the healing and the freedom,
Yes.
right? Which is why when we talk about for mental health professionals, to not only look at how trauma affects our thoughts, our feelings, our body, our behavior, but it also affects our spirituality.
Yes.
So some people lose their faith. I've had people who say, if God loved me or was powerful, why didn't God stop it? And that's an authentic space for people to need to be able to wrestle with. I think a lot of times in churches, people don't like questions. You know,
Yes.
most of our Bible studies, especially if you get a church that's a certain size, there's no time for questions.
Yeah.
Like, this is just the facts, and then go back to your car, right?
Yes.
And in our church tradition, we even have a song that people sing that is, no doubt, no doubt, I didn't have no doubt.
Right.
And people are clapping and swaying. Well, some people have some doubts or some questions, right? And
Yes.
when you respond, when they say, I prayed for my mother to be healed from cancer and she died.
Yes.
And then you have a minister who says, God needed another voice in his heavenly choir. Like, that's the answer,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's the answer. So there is a need for us, I think, to also be able to embrace the mystery of God, that we don't have all the answers, not answers that will really satisfy,
Yes.
right? And to be able to sit with that, because some of these cookie cutter responses just make people silent,
Yes.
right? That I guess I can't say how I really feel.
Yes. So here it is. You're talking about this in terms of what we as mental health professionals may need to know. Why is this important for clergy and pastors and preachers to understand trauma, the negative religious coping,
Mm-hmm.
and being trauma informed?
Yes. One, we are surrounded by trauma, right? We're in the midst of a pandemic. We're in the midst of racial trauma. Last year in 2021 was the highest rate of hate crimes in the past 12 years. So some people think this is all historical. Like, why don't you all get over it? That was a long time ago. It's like the highest in 2021 in major cities in the US. Hate crimes were up 39 to 44%. Right? That's not even including how prevalent child abuse is, sexual abuse is, domestic violence. So our school shootings, you know, there are some I teach at a university, there are some international students whose parents won't let them come and study in the States because it's not safe. They see all these school shootings and they're afraid to send their children. You know, we have this idea that, like, you know, every place else is terrible and we're just living like this best life, but there's trauma all around. So ministers really need to be informed and better prepared in terms of responding, because you know, I have the Master's of Divinity and, you know, enjoyed my program, and yet I will say the only class we had in pastoral counseling, which was called Ministry During Times of Crisis, that class, 90% of it was on grief, which is important. Every preacher
Right.
will have to, like most preachers, will have to do a funeral and help people through the grieving process. But when you say this was the only class on pastoral counseling and
Yeah.
there was no mention of sexual assault,
Right.
right? No mention of all of the other traumas that people endure. So you don't prepare ministers, and then you tell members the only people they can talk to is ministers.
Right.
It's like a setup for frustration, disappointment, and ineffectiveness.
Yes. Yes.
So to also, eh, one, better prepare and train ministers to recognize even the signs of trauma and to better understand our role.
Yes.
So one of the issues around, for example, intimate partner violence, and last month was Domestic Violence Awareness Month, is that in many churches, the priority has been on saving the marriage, even if it's killing the people,
Right.
right?
Right.
So someone comes in and says they've been abused by their spouse, and the minister responds, you need to pray and submit. If you're more submissive, you won't get beaten.
Right.
Right? So it's very harmful, and it, you know, it does not honor God, and that, you know, these bodies are the temple of God.
Absolutely.
So, you know, it's in most cases, it's not coming from a malicious place. It's coming from a place of ignorance, not being informed. And I should also say that about various mental illnesses. I've heard, you know, people in churches say, trying to remember. So this guy was preaching an online Bible study, and he said, when you disconnect from God, that's a schizophrenic mindset.
Mm.
I'm like, what are you talking? Like, do you know what
Right,
schizophrenia is?
right,
Like, you don't
right,
know what it is. It just sounded good to you and you threw it in your Bible study.
right.
So people can do like damage with not knowing. So the importance of being willing to make referrals and to know that's not a bad thing. That's that you're going to do your role. Like I will pray with you, I'll meet with you, give encouraging scriptures. That's important because one of the things I tell communities of faith is as therapists, we usually at the most give people an hour a week. You know,
Yes,
people will talk about us and our boundaries. We're
yes,
like,
right,
okay, the hour's up,
yes,
right? But
right.
like if you have a church family, most church families will have more availability, like where people will, meet with you, talk to you, stay on the phone with you, pray with you. You can go to church for every like experience that they're having. And so so making use of therapy doesn't mean that they are devaluing what they get from the faith community, but it's for us to work collaboratively as a team, right?
Absolutely.
And so I would like to say it's important that we not engage in toxic spirituality,
Right.
which is when people think if you love God, you will be happy and at peace every day of your life and every moment of the day. It's kind of
Yes,
like a mental health prosperity gospel, right?
yes, right.
And so, we have that saying, too blessed to be stressed. And if
Yes,
any of us are honest, we have been blessed and stressed at the same
that's
time.
right, right. It's not
Right?
either or, it's both
No,
and.
yeah, stress is real, and I really do
Yes,
love God, right?
yes,
So, and it's also not biblical, right? When we look at the prophets, Old Testament and New Testament, when we look at the disciples, when we look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, like that's truth telling, like
yes,
loving God deeply. And you look at David, I mean, if you ever read the Psalms,
yes,
goodness, right?
yes,
So that's what that's what our true humanity
yes,
is that, while we're in the storm, God is present. And yet, the storm is serious and
yeah,
it's raging.
yes,
So the truth sets us free.
yes.
And a part of the truth may include depression, anxiety, addiction, panic attacks. It's a part of bipolar disorder. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I appreciate what you said because one of my passions is training students in seminaries as well and connecting the psychological with the theological.
Hmm.
And if people only have one class that's focused only on grief,
Right.
we have to ask this, we have to say, if you can't help them, at least don't hurt them,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
so let's work collaboratively because we
Hmm.
are designed to be in relationship,
That's
right?
right.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. It's such a gift,
yeah,
too. So I would say, for every pastor, for every church, to gather a list of referrals, who are mental health providers in the community of your church. And if you can also find out information about if they have sliding scale or take insurance, and just have that sheet available that, yes, I'm going to meet with you, as your pastor, as your minister. And in addition to that, you may want to make use of some additional support
yeah.
and not to judge people for that. It doesn't mean like they didn't pray enough or any of these things. So they have T-shirts and the slogan on social media, which is you can pray and have a therapist.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, Dr. Bryant, how would you respond? And I've heard this
Mhm.
from, we don't need a therapist, we don't need a counselor, we just need to pray more about it.
Yeah. So the challenge with that is some of us are praying our cognitive distortions.
Mm,
Right? So you may be praying a lot, but the way you're thinking about it is faulty. I'll give you the example of I was working with a client who was sexually assaulted as a high school student. And she was talking about how her major coping strategy had been prayer. And
mhm,
so I asked her, what had she been praying?
right.
And her prayer was, God, please forgive me for not being a virgin anymore.
Mm,
You see, the thought is already,
right.
you can't get healed from rape as you're praying about your feeling of guilt.
Yes.
right? So I just pray that over and over again, over and over again, over and over again, right?
Yes.
So there is there's a part of therapy is psychoeducation,
Yes.
and the truth is uh, there are some things we were not taught.
Yes.
So it's not just like if I pray and will myself that I will quote unquote act better. Like some people have never seen a healthy relationship. They don't even know like what should I expect, especially because we tell people relationships are work.
Yes.
So when is it work and when is this abusive?
Yes.
Right? So sometimes you need to be able to have someone you can talk that through with because the clarity isn't coming because we don't have that foundation. And also, it's healing to have someone bear witness and still find you acceptable.
Yes.
So many of us are burdened with shame.
Yes.
And the feeling is not just that I have to figure it out in prayer, is that I'm so ashamed no one can know.
Yes.
Like if I told anybody what I did, they would find me unacceptable. So what a gift it is to like be in the presence of another and to be able to speak my truth and the world didn't end.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So a part of it is there's healing in relationship.
Yes.
A part of it is learning skills, you know,
Yes.
things that we just didn't know. Some of us grew up in environments where you were silenced,
Yes.
right? That could be around gender, race, religion. You know, the phrase I often talk about it in my community is people would tell children, fix your face.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Fix your face. You're not allowed to look like you have an attitude. You better not look disappointed. You better not look angry. You're supposed to look like pleasant or neutral.
Yes.
Right? So when you grow up like that, and that is the kind of adult who, even when their heart is breaking, you say, how are you? And they say, I'm blessed.
Yes.
Like, are you all right? Oh, I'm better than blessed.
Yes.
Right? So there's no healing there because there's no truth there. So some people will need the support to be able to break out of that silence and shame and to learn that it's not a sin to have a voice,
Yes.
to have emotions, to have fears, to have needs.
Yes.
That's, you know, that's liberating.
Yes, it is. And I'm going to put a pin in terms of the role of the church, because what you're talking about is helping people to liberate, helping them to come home, the homecoming, to be their genuine, authentic self. And we as clinicians and helping professionals, being co-journers, as you mentioned in your book, and unconditional positive regard and genuineness. So let's talk a little bit more about your book, Homecoming. What prompted you to write this book?
Yeah. So I will say one of the, you know, pieces of being a pastor's daughter and growing up in the African American community is like our churches, for the most part, are not just open on like Sunday morning for like an hour or two.
Yes.
It's like it's really a community center, right? So at the church I grew up in, we had an AA degree program, we had a school, we had a women's center, we had an outreach center where you can come and get free clothes and free food. Like it was, we call wraparound services now, but then it was just church.
Right.
And so when I think about my path with psychology, there has always been an emphasis on how do you get psychology into the hands of everyday people, right? That it should not just be in the academy. So you all, like we write these journal articles and like nobody reads them but each other because you can't access them unless like you're at a university. So we do all this work. I have all these publications you'll never see. They're like locked in a in the library. And then I've written academic books, which are used as textbooks, and they make textbooks very expensive. And also, you have to talk a certain kind of way as an academic, right? So I would not like hand that book to my grandmother, right?
Yes.
And so I have been looking at ways to break out beyond the academy and just the private therapy office. So I did that with starting the podcast. It's called the Homecoming Podcast. And I do that through social media. And so I put like kind of mental health quotes or tips on Instagram and Twitter, and just this year joined TikTok. Got to get the young people.
Yes.
And so the podcast is actually what led to the opportunity for the book, where someone reached out to me and said, we see the response to the podcast, and would you be interested in writing, the homecoming book? And I'm like, I would love to. And can I write it like for everyday people to be able to hear it, to be able to understand it? And then what I loved on top of it is they even let me do the audio book, which was great. Because when I'll tell you, one of my cousins, when she found out I had a book, it was like 200 pages, she said, if it was audio, I would listen to it. I said, it is audio. Go get my book.
Yes, that's right.
So, yeah. So, just trying to make it so that knowledge is power.
Yes.
And knowledge is healing. And it should not be for the elite or the wealthy or only with people with like advanced degrees.
Yes.
And so, and I teach at Pepperdine University. And it's one of the things I do with my graduate students in my lab is have us go into South Los Angeles and do mental health workshops. And I have to like deprogram them, because at first when we're practicing, they sound like they're giving like an oral presentation in class, which is very, jargony.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're always talking to people who talk like you don't realize you're saying things nobody knows what you're saying.
Right.
And so to learn how do you talk about depression? How do you talk about anxiety? When we do pieces on grief, especially around the holidays is a very difficult time for a lot of people, either the relationships they no longer have or what they never had.
Yes.
And then they compare despair, seeing people in social media with the matching pajamas and looking like everybody's having a happy holiday. And so to be able to bring the message is the reason I wrote the book Homecoming. And the title is because my area of focus is trauma recovery, and trauma disconnects you from yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You doubt yourself. In order to survive, you focus a lot on other people. Mm-hmm. So you might engage in like the people pleasing. How do they want me to be? How do they want me to talk? What do I need to do so that they will be happy with me? Because then I'll be safe. Mm-hmm. And so all of that takes us away from ourselves. And so you can spend years on jobs unfulfilled, years in relationships where you're drowning. And as long as other people are pleased with you, you feel like I just need to stay, or don't even know that like your own joy is possible. Right. So to heal is to come back home to yourself. And I mentioned in the book, and I'll say now, even if you're coming home for the first time, because some people had early trauma where they don't remember a self before having been in their household. They were born into it. Right. And so they're like, well, what would that mean for someone like me? It's like, there is a you that exists beyond the trauma, even if you never got to know them. Yes. And so now you get to meet you for the first time.
Yes. Yes, I really like that. And your book is kind of divided into 3 parts: the signs of homesickness, sickness, disconnection, long-term skills and mindset, and strategies for addressing major roadblocks. Could you just give us a brief summary of each of those 3 parts?
Yeah. So the first one is recognizing the warning signs, because some people don't know they're disconnected from themselves. Yeah. Right? So you're like, oh, that sounds like an interesting book, but it has nothing to do with me. Right. And it's like, in different ways, all of us disconnect. Right. Yes. And so there can be the emotional signs when you're stuck in your rage, or when you are dealing with depression or anxiety or numbness. That's also a trauma response. We see all this stuff happening around us. When we saw those numbers climbing with COVID, if you saw all that and like felt nothing, right? That's a trauma response. Yes. Or even some of us responded with denial, right? And said, the numbers must be fake. That many people couldn't have died. Yes. It's like, tell that to those people's families, right? But I understand what that is. It's too overwhelming. It's too unbelievable. It must be a trick. It must be a lie, right? Yes. So Emotionally, there are signs of disconnection, and then there are also behavioral signs.
Yes.
So what are we doing to medicate ourselves? A big one are these phones, which are addictive and designed to be addictive. So it's like insomnia, but scrolling, midnight scrolling. If I was with you all in person, I would say, somebody say amen.
Amen. Somebody put in the chat, amen.
Yes, yes. So, we're just like trying to soothe ourselves, trying to comfort ourselves. Yes, thank you, Robert. We also do that with food, right? Emotional eating.
Yes.
And I like to bring this one up in church because sometimes people get very self-righteous when we bring up substances because they're like, oh, I've never been on drugs, and only people of the world are on drugs.
Right.
And I'm like, let's look at your food.
Yes, right.
Look at how we are medicating ourselves with this sugar and all the quote unquote comfort food, but we have like the health consequences of that. Some of us are medicating ourselves with gossip, where we like to talk about everybody else. And you hear some of us talk about celebrities, and you would think like we know these people personally,
right.
like all up in their life, and like, okay, what's going on with you?
Right.
So, and another sign of disconnection is unhealthy friendships and romantic relationships. To maintain relationship with someone who dishonors you requires that you disconnect from yourself. There's no other way. Right? I can't, if like at my core, I know my friend does not really like me, and I'm still saying that's my friend and keep calling and texting them, I'm disconnected. Right? So that's what that section is about. And then I talk about what are some skills and strategies to help you to reconnect with yourself.
Yes.
And so one of those strategies is around social support and community support. And so, I'm sorry, self-care and community care. So we want to think about the kind of basics of, can you try to go to bed an hour earlier? Yes. Right? Some of us are just sleep deprived. That's not why we're like so irritable and stressed out. Yes. And so a lack of rest, lack of nutrition. Oops. I saw the lamp was starting to fall. Is it going to keep falling? Okay. Yeah. So that look, we're going to be in the dark in a minute. Let's see. Okay. There we go. That's a little better.
Yeah.
So self-care and community care. And then another one I call, and others have used this term, reparenting yourself. Yes. So some people are very angry at their parents, and for some, understandably so. But I can remain stuck in my anger and frustration for how my parents got it wrong, or I can start to give myself the things I was never given, right? To care for myself. Because some of us treat ourselves the same way that abusers treated us. Yes. Right? With that self-neglect and self-abandonment.
Yes.
So let me love on myself. Let me give myself the things that I wish I had been given, right? And another one is building self-confidence. And people always want, these magazine articles, 3 steps to being a confident person. Right? They want it to be instant. And one of the things I talk about is that it's with practice. It's not just like overnight, but it's the more I do something, the more confident I become. So it's like when I first was in graduate school for psychology, they first are very protective. Because you're just starting, right? So if someone's like in major crisis, they would say, oh, this person needs someone with more experience, right? But then the more you do the work, the more it's like, okay, I can do this. So some of us need to have more self-compassion and patience instead of expecting ourselves to be an overnight expert or expecting ourselves to be an expert in everything, which is just perfectionism. And perfectionism is a setup to punish yourself. Right?
Yes.
And then the last section is how to deal with major obstacles on the road back home to yourself. Yes. Because if we only had to deal with like, oh, I need to build my confidence, or I need to take more naps, or aromatherapy, right? All those things, we're like, okay, if I could just do that. But then some of us we have some major roadblocks.
Mhm.
So that can be being a survivor of child abuse. That can be experiencing oppression and discrimination. That can be working in a toxic work environment that has chipped away at your self-confidence.
Yes.
And so that can be breakups and divorce. So heartbreak can be very devastating.
Yes.
And so, helping people to navigate those waters so they can reconnect to themselves
Yes.
is the purpose of the book. And I'm so grateful for the responses that I've gotten from people from all walks of life. And I'll say each chapter includes like little scenarios, little vignettes, and
Mhm.
people really appreciate that because one, it's like you're not the only one. And
Yes.
two, it makes it more real as opposed to me just listing off symptoms, right? But
Right.
like some stories from my life and stories from other people's lives of what this has looked like.
Yes. Thank you so much. And, for me as a clinician, but also, in ministry, I like that there's like homework assignments and prompts, and I can use that as a guide.
Mhm.
How could this book be beneficial for the church and clergy and faith-based leaders?
Yes. So I have had multiple churches who have told me they created a book club. So they would, read each chapter and then come together and discuss the homework. I know preachers who have used it for the foundation of a sermon. So there have been multiple homecoming sermons. A common scripture for the homecoming sermon is the prodigal son.
Yes.
So, you think about that, reconnecting and coming back to God and coming back to yourself. People have used it on retreats for us to have kind of mental health workshops, but from a Christian or spiritual perspective. So it's definitely something that can be utilized as an individual or as a group.
Yes, and I really like that. And, you know, I like the idea of when we talk about bridging the gap between faith and mental health. As I was reading it and when we talk about that true, genuine, authentic self, I'm thinking about Psalm 139, and he formed you in your mother's womb and he knows the plan for you, right? And I talk,
Yes.
God, Jeremiah 29:11. And so how do we weave the scriptures in with what we're reading in the book? And that's what I found that's been beneficial and useful as well, to connect
Ah,
and theology and psychology and the biblical
mhm.
foundations.
Yes. And the reality is there are a lot of trauma narratives in the Bible.
Mhm.
I think oftentimes, they don't get preached.
Yes.
But when we actually begin to tell the story of Hagar, when we
Mhm.
actually tell the story of Tamar, when
Mhm.
we actually look at the crucifixion as a trauma, that was torture.
Yes.
So I think there are plenty of openings for us
Yeah,
to talk about the healing journey.
absolutely. So now let's bring it back to the role of the church. And how do we help, or what are additional tips for churches and clergy and nominations and seminaries to bridge the gap between faith and mental health, to dispel those stigmas and those biases?
Yes. So one, I would say incorporating it in your liturgy. So, sometimes on Women's Day or these various days, we have like a specially written litany.
Mhm.
So I would say, around mental health to be able to incorporate themes in the litany. When you do an altar call to pray, we like to hide in metaphors.
Yeah.
I'm climbing up the rough side of the mountain. I've been
Right.
in the valley. I've
Yeah.
been in the storm, right? But to actually say in a prayer, and God, we bring before you all of those who are feeling anxious this morning. God, we
Yes.
bring before you those who are struggling with depression, and not in a condemning way, right? But from a place of compassion and love,
Yes.
to name that. God, we are here, and among us are those who are grieving. And so we are praying for your comfort, right?
Yes.
So in our prayers, in our sermons, I would say when we love to do these retreats, or before COVID, or, now people are gathering again to incorporate it in the retreat. And I want to say, the minister doesn't have to know everything. And so there are organizations like NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, that will send speakers out for free.
Yes.
So just when you contact them, you can ask them, is one of your volunteers Christian?
Yes.
If you would like them to come from that perspective to talk about what is it like living with bipolar disorder and being a Christian,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And if not NAMI, in our congregations, our social workers, our therapists, our psychologists. So even during announcements, if you can let them, have a mental health moment, come up and give
Yeah.
a couple of tips. One of the easy ones is a lot of churches have those health fairs. Make one of the tables a mental health table with a little
Yes.
questionnaire and surveys about signs of depression, signs of
Yes.
domestic violence, and then have like the resources of where people can call and get help. Um,
Yes.
and I'll say also leading by example. The
Yes.
old model was people believing the pastor had to be someone who like never had any problems.
Yes.
And we know with the mass exodus out of churches, one of the big things young people have said is they want more authenticity and more
Yes.
transparency. Well, people misunderstood that data and just said, okay, now pastors need to wear like jeans with holes in them and undershirts. So that's like, that's the magic formula. So we look relatable,
Right.
right? It's like, if you change your outfit, but the heart is the same, it still feels like disconnected.
Yes.
So, not in a way of like that you're bleeding on the congregation, but to be able, to be honest about, how God, and if you've gone therapy, has been helpful, right?
Yes.
That can set a lot of people free. One of my former pastors talked about going to therapy, and it just gave so many people permission who felt like that's like something they shouldn't do. And it was like, now we know like pastor is like right up there with God, right?
Yes.
So if
Yes.
pastor is going to therapy, maybe it's okay to go.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I like that. And so I'm going to flip flop it around because we both, train psychologists and counselors. I mentioned I just spoke to a class. How do we weave in more the spiritual and religious perspective in our training programs for psychology and for counseling and social work? And
Mhm.
what can we do?
Yes. So important. Right now, a lot of times, faith, religion, spirituality is either avoided or pathologized, most often avoided. And, what research shows is that mental health professionals, on average, endorse lower religiosity than the general public, are just less likely to be religious. So, what does that mean? It means often you have people of no faith creating the healing model for people for whom faith is important.
Mhm.
And so there can be a lack of even understanding of what it is. I'll give you an example. And I mentioned I teach in a graduate program, and I had one of the graduate students who was seeing clients in our clinic who came and sought me out because she didn't grow up religious, and she has a Christian client who was talking about fasting. So she
Mhm.
wanted to know from me, is that an eating disorder,
All right.
right?
Mhm.
And let me say, there are some people who are calling it fasting who do have an eating disorder.
Right,
That's not
right.
everybody, but how do you even tease that apart if you don't know what that is or the questions to ask, right? Um, so it requires more people who are, I'm going to say, bilingual,
Yes,
right, who
yes,
understand both worlds and can
yes,
not only translate it in the moment, but more of us writing and publishing. So
yes,
there are books like Spiritually Integrated Psychotherapy. There is Christian Modification for Trauma-Focused CBT. So there are models out there, and we just need to do a better job of sharing them, of teaching them. And, what I tell mental health providers is you need to be able to hold both of these truths at the same time.
absolutely.
On one side, for many people, faith has been a source of strength and a source of meaning, and the source that allowed them to make it, to survive.
Yes,
And there are many people who have been harmed in religious spaces.
Yes.
And what happens is usually people are only willing to acknowledge one or the other.
Right.
And if you grew up in church and love it, then you don't usually even make room for the harmful things that have happened. Or if you were harmed in those places or didn't grow up in it, then you may just devalue it and dismiss it.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So we have a lot of education to do, and I'm glad you're bringing up both sides, because often when people talk about Christians not going to therapy, we usually just focus on ministers discouraging them from going. But I need to say that some have gone and had not good experiences, right? So both think there is work to do in both areas.
Absolutely. And what I appreciate about our fields, I mean, the rationale, it's not just you and I saying it, but our codes of ethics say it and include spirituality and religion on our codes of ethics. If we're coming from a wellness model, it includes spirituality, and it's just about who a person is, mind, body, and spirit. So I like to help my students and those that I'm supervising understand, no, you don't have to have a perfect match, but it's about understanding the client or understanding the congregant and where they are or the clergy, and understanding where they are to provide effective helping services.
Right. And I should say, you know, for those who are not in the mental health field, but thinking about therapy, you also want to reflect within yourself of who would you feel more comfortable talking to. There are some Christians who only want to go to a Christian therapist. There are some Christians who the last thing they want to do is talk to a Christian therapist. And if you ask them why, they'll say, because they're going to be judgmental. And like, you know, I live with my boyfriend, I smoke, so we have to be, so I'm clear in my my various vocations that, you know, in my work as a psychologist, and even to be honest, in my work as a minister, I don't approach the work from the lens of condemnation.
Yes.
Right. But some people do.
Yes.
So, you know, that will be a part of how people decide who they want to talk to, who they feel safe with.
Absolutely. Now, I know we have about 10 minutes remaining. Did anyone on Facebook Live have any questions? Anyone on Zoom have any questions for Dr. Bryant? And I know that one person is on, Reverend Dr. Joan Prentice from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I shared with her your work with sacred dance, because that's an area she's really passionate about. So could you say a little bit about your work with sacred dance?
I love it. Yes. So I grew up doing liturgical dance, and I like to say that dance saved my relationship with my body, and dance was an outlet to be able to speak the unspeakable and to be connected with God. And a community, right? A community of other people who were dancing. It's interesting, psychology is kind of late to the party. And so now in psychology, we have something called embodied healing, or they have somatic therapy. Soma means the body. And so recognizing stress and trauma are in the body. So sometimes we need more than just cognitive, right? You know, some people, we can ruminate, we can talk ourselves into circles, but it hasn't translated, right? Because, you know, we have something called somatic complaints.
Yes.
So that's when you have physical symptoms that don't have a medical explanation. They're like from stress. So some people say, I'm not depressed, but I have backache. I'm not anxious, but I'm nauseous, right? I grind my teeth at night, or my hair is falling out, or my skin is breaking out. The body is telling the story.
Yes.
And so there is some release, there is some freedom, there is some healing that actually comes in our movement. And I'll tell you one quick thing, which is beautiful about that. So trauma psychologists have done research in this area called the vagus nerve, part of the nervous system. And they look at what are ways to help people calm the nervous system. And along with taking cleansing breath, deep breath, they also say humming and rocking
Yes.
You think about any church,
Yes.
right? People are
Yes.
rocking and humming and
Yes.
patting themselves,
Yes.
right? So it's like, give grandma that $1 million grant because she could have
Right.
told you, right?
Right.
Humming
Right.
and rocking. But I say that because sometimes when I say sacred dance, people will say, oh, I'm not a dancer. That won't work for
Right.
me. It
Right.
doesn't mean you have to do like splits and high kicks, right?
Right. Right.
But just being able to rock, to sway, to lift up holy hands, all of
Yes.
that can be very healing.
Absolutely. I love it. I love it. And I'm gonna have to somehow bridge the gap between you and Reverend Prentice because you have some like-minded passions.
Beautiful.
So, yes. Reverend Dr. Robert Rogers, are you still on? Did you have a comment or question?
I am still on. I just have loved this conversation, and especially with my concern with stress and burnout that pastors experience. I think for me, it's so important for pastors had to have self-awareness. I
Mhm.
mean, if they are going to really help parishioners in a concrete sort of way, it's really being self-aware, is being authentic, and then being in tune with their own areas of growth and their own stresses, their own anxieties, so forth and so on. So I really I preach about this stuff and self-care and anxiety and depression, but I really love the idea of a mental health moment. I'm going to run with that.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that in the church to have a mental health moment. We do, of course, we do announcements, but
Right.
why not a mental health
Yeah.
moment and whatever?
Right.
Because
Mhm.
the important thing for the church is that we are equipping folks to live when they leave the church building.
Right.
That's right.
And
That's
so, we hope that the worship experience will bring transformation and liberation, but folks need tools that when they leave the church building, that they can implement them and live more effectively and more
Yeah.
peacefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm appreciating you saying that, including the mental health of ministers. And that was the group that I was asked to do a lot of Zoom workshops with during the pandemic because they were overwhelmed. Like parishioners getting mad because they didn't want to come for in-person visits when people had COVID, right? Or just a whole lot of high expectations and objectifying that you should just 24/7 be ready and available for everyone while you yourself are going through it and carrying a heavy load. So that's an important piece to look at. And then I'm glad you said the mental health moment because it also made me think about, I'm going to say, particularly in our churches, or Pentecostal or churches that are high worship, to integrate some time for silence. It can be brief,
Yeah.
but our churches, we love, we love it. We love to be at level 10.
Yes.
And sometimes, it can be healing and helpful for us to be able to be silent together in the presence of God. And I'll give you one phrase that one of my professors gave us in that ministry during times of crisis class. He said, every church now has a praise team, but what they need is a lamentation team.
Wow.
Ah,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
Everything is like, Jesus, Jesus. And
Yes.
it's like, there's a lot of grief.
Yes.
And I think many of us have created an environment where people feel like if they're not at 100, that they shouldn't come,
Yes.
right? And so that's not really sanctuary if I have to look like I'm on top of the world just to be here.
Yes. Yes. That's good. That's
Yeah,
good.
for sure.
I've had some other comments. So one person said, I'm still thinking about you, Dr. Bryant, saying there's no healing without telling the truth and the trauma in the scriptural text. If we can't tell the truth about the text that we depend on for truth, how can we heal?
Yeah, so important.
Yeah.
So important. I mean, many people have not really sat with the trauma of the cross.
Mhm.
We're so we say it like it's a love story. and I get that, but it's like just sometimes I have been in some sanctuaries where the way people are telling the story, it's like, and there are kids there, and it's like it's a torture. It's like a 1 hour torture sermon that ends with, and he rose.
Right,
And
right,
I'm like, that somehow, like, that didn't really feel good. And
right,
then, and people say it doesn't matter for you to feel good. It's the gospel.
right.
Well, there's also a way that I'm going to be upset with myself that I can't cite this author. But one of the authors we had to read in seminary said, uh, there's nothing boring about the story. So if people are exiting the church, it is something wrong with the storyteller,
Oh, wow.
right?
Wow.
How are we telling the story?
Right, right,
Yeah.
right.
It's a great story, but who's telling it?
Yeah. You had me thinking too, because when you were talking about the trauma of the crucifixion, I'm also thinking about the trauma of the people who witnessed it, right? And we
Yeah.
already know the
Right.
research of bystanders
Curious. Yep.
witnessing trauma and
Yeah.
bullying events. And so it just has me thinking, and
Right.
I'm going to process that a little bit
Right. Which
more.
is why, a lot of disciples were hiding,
Yes, yes,
scared.
yes. This
Hmm.
is good. This
But
is
the
good.
women, the
Yeah.
women were there
I love it. I love it.
in the face of
Uh,
the bloody trauma. Yeah.
that's right. Another comment. This was just so awesome. What a blessing. So
Amen.
yes, amen. And I just want to say thank you. But before we close out, is there anything else that you'd like to say that we haven't discussed?
I would just say for us to all self-reflect, because I think the way church culture trains us, many of us think immediately about how we can apply this to everyone else.
Mhm.
And we can lose sight of ourselves.
Yes.
And so, especially if you're in ministry, to think about your own boundaries and your own care,
Mhm.
that you don't have to be a mini Messiah. We have a Messiah.
Right.
And so, just to take good care of ourselves as we try to take care of others.
Absolutely. So, how can people find you? Your webpage, how can they find out about the Homecoming podcast?
Yes. So the Homecoming podcast is on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. My website is drtama.com, and I'm on social media as Dr. Tama. So on Twitter, it's just DRTHEMA, but on Instagram, I have the period. So Dr. period Tama. And then the book, Homecoming, if you want to support small bookstores, you can do Indie Bound. If you're good with the big ones, then Amazon and Barnes and Nobles.
Yes. And I have it both on Kindle and the hard copy. And
Yay!
I'm probably going to get the audio book because I'm going to find a way to use
Right, to listen
it.
to it.
Yes.
Oh, I enjoyed getting to be able to record it, and glad to be able to be with you all on today. Oftentimes, and I'm sure you can attest to this, then like one part of us is welcome in some places. Some people
Yes.
only want one. So it's a beautiful when we have places where we can be integrated and talk about it holistically.
Yes. Dr. Thema Bryant. And again, I apologize for the
Oh,
mispronunciation.
that's all right. It's okay.
But thank you so much for being on Talking with Dr. T. This has just been a great conversation.
Thank you. From one Dr. T to the next.
That's right. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We will be back again in December, and be on the lookout for our guests that we will have in December. Everyone have a wonderful holiday season. And Dr. Bryant, God bless you, and God bless everyone else who's on. And I am just so happy too. I just have to mention my sister, Reverend Brandy, who's on as well. So thank you, my sister, for supporting. And thank you to the students and Dr. Janelle Robinson, the professor at Lenore Ryan, and her students who were on tonight. Everyone have a good night.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.